This is another presentation of how to use Ajax in Ruby on Rails. What we're going to do this time is to add a new vendor, and when we add the vendor, rather than refreshing the whole page or even refreshing the table, we're simply going to insert the new row into the correct place in the table. So, for example, if this were Alan, the vendor would be created at the beginning, put before the next one. If it were Warthog, it would get tucked in after the last one. So there'll be some special coding for that actually. And if it were somewhere in the middle, it will get created in the middle, right there. When the table entry gets put in, the three buttons which need the ID of the new record, they end up with it because of the way this is created. So if we were to do an inspect on this, the Allen item has got the correct ID for that particular vendor. So it's 46. Applique has got 10, but 46 was added there, so it's the correct one. So when you do a show or a delete or an edit, it will be updating the correct record. And this is the code that provides that functionality. The first thing is the main page, index.html.erb, and the button we're looking at here is, so it says new vendor, and it goes to the new vendor path, which is in routes. And what this basically does is it goes to the vendor controller and the process new. The process new in the vendor controller sets up a new vendor and puts it in the instance variable vendor. Then at this point, instead of going back to new.html.erb, it's going to go to new.js.erb because this is Ajax. And what Ajax does here is it simply sets up the partial underscore new.html.erb, which is going to be the modal form, and it sticks it in vendor modal, which is a place on the main page. And then it simply shows the modal. The modal looks like this. It's a normal Bootstrap modal, modal dialog, modal content, and then it's got a modal header and a modal body and a modal footer. The button is in the footer. The form is in the body. In this case, the form only has one field, and that field is name. Once you enter the name, you click the button, and what happens is it's going to go to the controller with the remote true, which means it's going to be, this is Ajax again. So it's going to go to, now it's going to go to the create portion of the controller. The create portion, again, is extremely simple. It creates the record with the vendor params. The vendor params would be all the fields in this form, which in this case is only name. It creates a new record with the name, sets up an ID, etc., and puts the new record in the instance variable vendor. At this point, again, because this is again Ajax, it's going to go back to create.js.erb. So create.js.erb. And the process there is, if there was an error on the create, it will simply show the error and stop. If there were no errors, it's going to grab, we set that instant variable of the vendor, it's going to grab the ID and it's going to grab the name and it's going to put them both into JavaScript variables. It's now going to go to the process called create row with the vendor name and the vendor ID. Create row sets up the TR for a new row. What it does is in the first one it puts the vendor name that you just created, and then it grabs the new vendor ID and puts it in the three areas that it needs it. So for the show, It's the href is vendors slash and then the ID. In this case, it's whatever. It also does the edit, which is the vendors slash the ID and then the word edit. And the delete is vendors, the ID slash delete. So those three buttons now will be set up with the proper IDs. Then it sets up and says, hey, make sure there's a hit. If there isn't a hit, that means it's at the end of the table, and so it's got to be put in at the end. We'll see that later. Then it grabs all of the TRs in the class vendor index, which is the table, grabs all the rows, and then it grabs the size of the rows. Now the size is the actual count. So for example, if there's 15 rows, it'll say 15, but the last row has got a value of 14. It's one less. So it says the last row is one less than the size, and it puts that in the variable last row. Now it's going to loop through the rows. What it's looking for is it grabs the name in the first column of the row. It says this, which is the row. It finds the TD with the class of vendor name, grabs the text, and that's the vendor name for this row. It then looks to see if the vendor name we're about to add is less than that name, and if it is, it adds the new row in front of that row. It sets the hit variable to say true, we did get a hit, and then return false, which is how to break out of the jQuery each loop. Then, if there is not a hit, then it's going to put it at the end. So if it's not a hit, then it's going to add the new row after the last row. And that's the process in create. And once it's done doing this create row, all it does is hide the modal, and the new row is there, and you're done. And you've got your new rows without having to refresh the table or refresh the page or anything.